So, warm welcome to this year's special presentation of the announcement of the Sveriges Riksbank's Prize in Economic Science in memory of Alfred Nobel. And together with students from Grillska gymnasiet in Västerås, we also have an expert, Gunnar Wetterberg. You're a historian and you have been the head of department on the Ministry of Finance before, and you also wrote a very good book on the Swedish Riksbank's history. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay,
Oh.
Good. Welcome. And welcome also all the people online watching. And after the presentation from HVA, the Royal Society, we will talk with you a little bit. You will explain a little bit more about the prize, the winners, the laureates and their work, and then we will get questions from you, the students from Grillska, and then also, of course, you can send us questions from wherever you are online at the Menti, and you will get the code for that in a bit. So, Gunnar, if we start off by talking a little bit about the recent history of the Economics Prize, do you have any recollection of anything special or any prize that you especially think is memorable?
I think what impressed me most was a prize that was given some 20 years ago to a man called Ronald Coase, which was before I was a member of the Academy myself. But he explained why there were enterprises, because if you look at standard economic theory, the markets does everything for you. And it was very difficult to understand why did you need enterprises. But he explained it in a very beautiful way that if you had to go to the market every day and sell all the goods you had produced the day before and buy all the things you needed for today's production, you would end up doing nothing but going to the market. So enterprises were there to conclude long-term contracts about selling, about buying, and thereby give room for production. I think that was a beautiful prize. And he earned it because he had written a paper on this. And in that paper, there was not a single equation. Okay. So everybody could read it and understand it. Then I was involved when Esther Duflo got the prize a couple of years ago. And that was encouraging, not only because she's a woman and we haven't had enough women laureates, but also because she was dealing with development cooperation. And early in my working life, I was at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and I was in charge of development cooperation to some of the countries that she'd studied. So it was rather fun to see her earn the prize for it.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite prizes as well, the recent years. So, okay, thank you very much. So, have you been involved today in choosing this year's Economics Prize winner? Or?
Well, it goes in several stages.
Can you explain?
We have a prize committee for every prize who does the tough work. I mean, going through all nominations, reading all papers.
How many are there?
They are 9 persons, more or less.
Approximately how many papers do they have to read?
Oh,
Sounds
incredible
like
numbers. They commission some 15, 20 separate studies every year on different topics, on some possible laureates and whatnot. So it's a hell of a work. And I'm a bit, one of my favorite colleagues in economic history, she will join the committee, and I'm afraid she won't have time to read to write the marvelous book that is underway. So it's a divided blessing. Then the prize committee presents its finding to the class of social sciences. The academy is divided into 10 classes. One is for social sciences. I'm a member of the class for humanities, but the classes for humanities and mathematics have one member that is attached to the class for social sciences. So we should give a humanities perspective when the social sciences people come up with their ideas. And the prize committee's suggestions is discussed in the full class at 4 different occasions.
Okay.
So the class is involved all the time, and then the academy in total takes the decision.
Thank you. Now we head over to the Royal Academy.
Välkomna till Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin och den här presskonferensen då vi ska presentera Sveriges Riksbankspris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne för 2022. Welcome to the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences and this press conference when we will announce this year's Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel for 2022. We will keep to our tradition and begin the presentation in Swedish, and then we will take it in English. And you are, of course, welcome to ask questions in either of these languages afterwards. Jag heter Hans Ellegren och är ständig sekreterare här vid Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin. Till höger om mig sitter professor Tore Ellingsen. Han är ordförande i kommittén för Sveriges Riksbankspris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne. Och till vänster, professor John Hassler, ledamot i priskommittén och sakkunnig i ämnet. My name is Hans Ellegren. I'm Secretary General of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. And to my right is Professor Tore Ellingsen. He's chair of the committee for the Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel. And to my left, Professor John Hassler, member of the committee and expert in this field. Årets pris handlar om banker. This year's prize is about banks. Kungliga Vetenskapsakademin har idag beslutat att utdela Sveriges Riksbankspris i ekonomisk vetenskap till Alfred Nobels minne för 2022 i lika delar till professor Ben Bernanke, The Brookings Institution, Washington DC, USA, till professor Douglas Diamond, University of Chicago, Chicago, USA, och till professor Philip Dybvig, Washington University in St. Louis, USA. Det tilldelas priset för forskning om banker och finanskriser. The Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences has today decided to award Sveriges Riksbanks Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel for 2022 to Ben Bernanke, the Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C., USA, Douglas Diamond, Washington University University of Chicago, in USA, and Philip Dybvig at Washington University in St. Louis, USA. They obtained the prize for research on banks and financial crises. Professor Tore Ellingsen will now give us a short summary of the field. Please.
We didn't know it at the time, but 15 years ago, much of the world stood at the brink of a devastating economic crisis. Most of us were unprepared for it. However, a few academic economists were both prepared and worried. They had studied the theory of bank runs. They believed the evidence in its favor, and they suspected that the possibility of runs was yet again becoming relevant. as events unfolded in 2008, 9, and 10, new evidence piled up in favor of the theory. In a nutshell, the theory says that banks can be tremendously useful, but they are only guaranteed to be stable if they are properly regulated.
I now leave the word to Professor Hassler, who will give a more detailed presentation of this year's prize. Please, John.
Thank you. So banks. Banks are for basically all of us a part of daily life. Most of the time, banks and the banking system works well, but sometimes part of it, or perhaps even the whole system fails. Banks go under, and a self-propelling downward spiral can start, leading to catastrophic consequences and even financial crisis. So financial crises are dramatic events. People run to the banks, bank runs appear. This can lead to banks failing, and this can spread like a wildfire to other banks and actually to the rest of the world. And we know that the consequences of these series of events are very dramatic, and they can also be quite long. We have seen these things happening in history many times, but we have also seen that it can happen during modern times in our economy today. So when you think about the consequences of financial crisis, and in particular about the central role that banks play, many questions arise. Couldn't we do without banks? Do we really need to have them? Is it the case that banks are inherently unstable, or is there some flaw in the construction of banks that could be fixed? When banks fail, couldn't new banks quickly arise, taking over the old customers so that the economy could start to be operative quickly again? And we also hear that banks create money. Is that even legal? And when we think about the consequences of bank runs and bank failures, wouldn't it be possible to change the system, to introduce measures that make the system more stable so that we don't see these dramatic events? Modern banking theory addresses and answers all these questions, and it rests on three fundamental contributions by the laureates this year. So let me now start to talk a little bit about the actual contribution that we recognize today. So Ben Bernanke, in a paper from 1983, showed with statistical analysis and historical sources that bank runs led to bank failures. And this was the mechanism that turned a relatively ordinary recession into the depression in the 30s, the world's most dramatic and severe crisis that we have seen in modern history. So he showed that banks need to be there. They need to be up and running for the economy to work. And if they don't, then the economy works worse, much worse. During the Depression, the income and production plummeted, the unemployment skyrocketed, and as we know, the whole thing spread to the rest of the world. At the time when Bernanke published this, this was a break with the current views. Of course, people had seen that banks failed, but it was more thought as a consequence of the crisis rather than a cause of the crisis. But now, the views of Bernanke have become the conventional wisdom and has received lots of solid empirical report during later times. Diamond and Debwig, in a paper in 1983, showed that banks are perfectly constructed to make sure that savings are transferred to productive investments. They do that by stepping in as an intermediary, a middleman, solving a quite natural conflict between savers and borrowers. And that conflict is that borrowers, they want to have liquid assets. They want to have access to their savings, while, so did I say borrowers? Of course, I mean savers. They want to have access to their savings all the time. And on the other hand, borrowers that make investments in, say, homes or in factories, they need to have a long-term commitment. So banks step in by doing what is called maturity transformation. And they then accept deposits from savings that savers can have access to continuously, and they transform that into long-term assets, the lending to households and firms. So in a sense, you could say that this is creating liquidity, creating money, not from thin air, but from the long-term assets, the lending that the banks do. So this was part of the paper. What they also show in this paper is that this maturity transformation is inherently vulnerable. If a rumor starts that people are going to take out their money from the bank, then everyone has an incentive to rush to the bank to take out money in time and not come last in line for taking out the money. And this can create failing banks. And this is something that's inherent in the maturity transformation. So maturity transformation is important, but it's also vulnerable. Diamond, he showed that banks are also perfectly constructed to serve another important purpose, and that is to monitor the borrowers. And they do that on behalf of the savers, again as a middleman between, an intermediary between the savers and the borrowers. So banks can do this in an efficient way, reducing the cost of credit and making it possible to finance more productive investments in society. A problem with this is that this monitoring requires knowledge about the borrowers. This is built up during the relation with the bank. And when the bank fails, this knowledge disappears and cannot easily be transferred to other banks. And that is why it's difficult for new banks to take over the old customers. And this is a reason for why banking crises tend to have very long-lasting consequences. So what's the importance of all this for society? Well, as I said, the laureates have provided the foundation for our modern understanding of why banks are needed, why they are vulnerable, and what to do about it. So in the laureates' work, it's shown that deposit insurance is a way of short-circuiting the dynamic behind bank runs. So with deposit insurance, there is no need to run to the bank, and bank runs don't really need to start. They also show that liquidity provision, lending of last resort from the central bank is a way of dealing with this. So the ideas
more about this with you, Gunnar. So we got a little technical difficulties here at the museum, so I could ask you to talk a little bit. If we start with Ludwig, can you talk a little bit about his findings and why he received the prize, just short?
Well, basically, the prize is for 3 different papers.
Okay.
And those papers complement one another. They are different in perspective. Ben Bernanke wrote about the big economic crisis in the 1930s, and he came up with a new explanation why it devastated the world economy. And that was because a lot of banks failed, and it was the failure of the banks that led to the catastrophic consequences. To start with, it was a fairly normal swing in the economy as we usually see them, but when it triggered off the failures of the different banks, it got much worse. And that was Bernanke's perspective, that when the banks failed, it became impossible for many firms to borrow to finance their production and their expansion. And when they couldn't borrow, the whole economy shrank. Dybvig and Diamond, if you say that Bernanke was empirical, historical, Dybvig and Diamond are more of theorists. They try to explain in theoretical terms why do we have banks, and the beauty of the banking concept is that borrowers have small amounts of money, but they put them in a bank, and the bank uses their money to pool many borrowers' money and lend it to firms or to investors or whatnot. And that means that money that I have and don't have to spend immediately, when they are pooled with many other people's money, they can be used to finance a brilliant idea that it would have taken that person 20, 30 years to assemble on his own. Suddenly, he can do it at once. And that's the real beauty of the banking concept. But there is a big but, and that is, if I hear a rumor that the bank might fail, I want to get my money back before the failure takes place. And the problem is that if the bank has to pay out, it is squeezed between the people who put money in the bank, who need it on short-term notice, and the lenders who borrowed money for long-term projects. And this imbalance between long-term and short-term is what Dybvig and Diamond try to explain in their first article from 1983. And they also come up with what can you do to avoid this failure taking place. And that is to introduce an insurance for people who put their money in the bank. So if the bank fails, the states will guarantee that they get their money back. And once the people know that, they don't become all that scared and they can leave the money with the bank. Diamond, in the third article, which receives this year's prize, he took it one step further. And he said that there was an added function of the bank that economists tend to overlook. And that is, if you want to put money in some kind of investment, say somebody comes up with a bright new idea for an invention, he wants to get it financed, then you as an investor has to see to it that he uses the money in an efficient way, that he doesn't take it to, go to the Bahamas or give some lavish parties or something. You have to supervise him. And for each and every person that has money, to supervise every investor would cause a tremendous amount of work. In comes the bank, takes care of all the money from us who have something to spare, does the lending and does the supervision of the borrowers to see to it that they use their money properly. This means that over the years, the bank builds up a knowledge of each and every investor and can follow them much more efficiently than I would be able to do myself if I had to do the supervision. But that also introduces a weakness in the system, because if the bank goes bust, suddenly all that knowledge about the investors is lost. And when there is no such knowledge, who would then dare to lend to the investors in the future? So Dybvig and Diamond, they explained the thing that Bernanke analyzed. They had the theory why it was important that banks didn't go bust. And Bernanke analyzed what happened when the bank went bust. That basically is what the prize is about.
Thank you, Gunnar. Very well explained. Then this, if I can give you some questions. Do you think the banks today are happy with this prize?
Yeah, I think so, actually, because this has proved to be one of the most useful theories. I mean, sometimes you see a Nobel Prize for something and it's sometimes very hard to imagine. I mean, what the hell is anybody going to do with that theory? But in this case, the theory has been used at repeated instances. We had a very difficult economic crisis in 2007, 2008, but the people who had read the articles of Bernanke and Diamond and Dybvig, they knew that it was important to have the safety nets that prevented banks from going bust. So they introduced depositors insurance, that is, I don't have to run to the bank to get my money back. But they also fed the bank with additional liquidity so that they could continue lending to people who wanted to invest. And that is probably the explanation why the 2008 crisis that everybody was afraid would be even worse than the crisis in the 30s never turned that bad. And you could also say that now, 2 years ago, with the pandemic, some people thought that that would lead to a devastating financial crisis. There was never even a glimpse of that, because from the beginning, every central banker in the world followed Dybvig, Diamond and Bernanke and took the measures to avoid a crisis. That is not to say that it is entirely without problems, because some people have said that when you introduce these kind of insurances and safety nets, well, won't banks behave irresponsibly? Won't we have reckless lending because they know that somebody will always come in and support them? That is what other economists today are working at. I mean, how can we devise punishments for those banks that behave irresponsibly? And that is also why we are toying with ideas like the banks should pay an insurance premium to the state every year so that the state can afford to bail them out if there's a problem. But that is not Dybvig, Diamond and Bernanke. That is perhaps a new prize in 20 years' time.
Okay. So that sounds like something I should have been very glad to hear in 2007, 2008. Then I wouldn't be so angry about the banks and the failings of the banks that I think run that crisis a bit in the US, started in the US, right?
Indeed, and there was an immediate effect which reminded of what they had described with the 30s, because all credits dried up because banks wouldn't trust each other. Interbank lending fell very rapidly, and but it picked up in only a couple of months' time. I mean, I'm in a project where I'm studied the building industry in Sweden, and the building industry relies very heavily on banks and credits, and it stopped very abruptly in the fall of 2008, but it resumed rather soon afterwards because banks started lending again, and that was not the pattern that was followed in the 1930s, where it took 5, 6, 7 years for lending to recover.
Yeah, and this was because of these findings or these theories. States use those. Is that what you're saying?
Indeed, and it is an irony of the prize that it was actually Bernanke who was then the head of Federal Reserve in Washington, which is the most important central bank in the world. So he was there to apply his own fundings, and that's rather uncommon in Nobel Prize history.
Yeah, but lucky, I guess, this time.
Yeah.
That's good. Good. So,
although, I mean, there are people who criticize him for some particular actions, but overall, I would say that his and Diamond's and Dybvig's theories, they helped contribute to the fairly successful outcome of the crisis.
Yeah, but because if you look at it in
retrospective.
Thank you. In retrospective, it's, as you said, it's short. It was a short downfall of the economy at that time.
At least in Sweden.
In Sweden.
I mean, the Swedish Central Bank and Ministry of Finance handled this among the best in the world. In other places, it took a longer time, and in Southern Europe, it was transformed into the Euro crisis. But basically, it could have run much worse than it did.
Okay, good. So, I think I will introduce the students. If you have any questions, please raise your hands. You will get a mic. And please introduce yourself with your name.
Jag heter Alice och jag undrar bara, är det inte lite läskigt att vi lägger så mycket tillit på bankerna och att det är så få människor som styr något så stort?
So this Swedish question, and Gunnar, you can answer in English if that's okay.
Yeah, Alice's question was, isn't it a problem that we put so much trust in the banks and that so few people government? And I mean, it's really an important question because banks control so much money. Dybvig and Diamond try to explain why this is rational, why this helps mankind perform better economically than we otherwise would have done. What they also say is that if we are to avoid some of the big problems, we need to regulate them from the state. And that, in a way, takes care of your question that even if few people govern the banks, the state represents us all in a democracy, and the state goes in to put in place the regulations that are needed to limit the risk-taking of the banks and avoid that they do damage to the rest of us. So, and of course, much else could be done about this, but I think that what they have done in their research is to pave the way for better regulation of the banks.
Okay, thank you, Gunnar. More questions, please.
Hej, Hugo. Varför, vi såg så här Lehman Brothers, de misslyckades liksom. Varför hände inte det med alla andra banker liksom så?
Well, why Lehman Brothers failed could probably illustrate this problem with lending on the long term and having short-term depositors, and there was a crunch between this. There was a big debate in the few weeks before Lehman failed, and some economists argued that Lehman should be rescued. Some argued that it should be allowed to fail because that would be a warning to all other financial actors. I'm also told that Lehman wasn't a bank in the proper sense, so there were some legal problems about rescuing that. I'm not that familiar with American financial legislation, but it's a good case. I mean, it was Lehman's failure that triggered off some of the worst moments in the 2008 financial crisis. But then central banks managed to grapple the situation within a few months and turn it for the better. But it's a very pertinent question, and I'm sure it will be asked in many places today.
More questions?
Oh, my name is Per, and my question is, jag kan ta det på svenska då, men hur hade dagsläget sett ut på ett ungefär om det inte hade varit för den här teorin och om det att folk har kvar sina pengar i banken på grund av försäkringen?
Well, what the economy would have looked like today if it weren't for those theories, that's one of the trickiest questions you can ask a historian. I mean, to have some, it's called counterfactual theory. If Napoleon hadn't lost at Waterloo, what would Europe have looked like? I think the most probable answer is that we would have been some percentage points poorer when you look at the gross domestic product, because it would have taken more time for economies to recover and lending to resume, and that would have lowered economic growth for a couple of years. Then it would have resumed. And it's also a question if it had gone badly wrong in 2008, well, then people would perhaps have drawn conclusions similar to those that now receive the prize. So we wouldn't have had a problem during the pandemic anyway. It's very hard to tell, but it's one of those things that it's rather amusing to think about it.
Thank you. More questions?
Hej, Axel heter jag. Varför tror du att priset oftast tilldelas pristagare inom makroekonomi?
Why does the prize go to people who have been active in macroeconomics? Well, this is, I mean, it's also a question. The borders between macroeconomics and other disciplines in economics is rather fluid. In a way, this is a prize in macroeconomics, but it's also a prize concerning financial markets and the way banks behave, which is a very micro question. So, but perhaps I'm not sure. Perhaps economists are more fascinated by macroeconomics. Perhaps also that what is expected from those who become laureates is that they have contributed to the benefit of mankind. And it is, of course, easier to see how some macroeconomic breakthrough in our understanding of how the economy works has an impact that is fairly easy to quantify. But I'm not a member of the prize committee, so you should actually put the question to them.
Questions?
Do you think a crisis like the one in 1930s would be possible again with these theories now in the world?
No, I'm fairly confident that it wouldn't happen, because many countries have introduced deposit insurance, which means that depositors don't have to run to the bank to get their money out. We have a problem that we have actors that perform similar functions as the banks do, and they are not always regulated. So you had during the crisis in 2008 some instances, for example in Britain, where they had mortgage societies that weren't under deposit schemes, as I understand it, for the banks. So it can still happen on the fringes, but it doesn't take the same consequences as it did in the 30s. And we have also come to understand that what is called lending of last resort, that is, if a bank is on the verge of failing, the state comes in some way and supports it so that it won't fail, or at least that it one can reconstruct it. And one of the big innovations from 2008 onwards is that we have this pouring of liquidity into the system. Sometimes one aspect of it is called quantitative easing, which means that central banks go in and buy bonds, which means that those who had owned bonds, they get cash in hand and they can contribute to lending and to money circulating in the economy.
Okay. Another question?
Ja, en fråga som kanske inte riktigt har med just priset att göra, men vad är ert bästa råd för oss som ungdomar om vi vill kunna förändra någonting i framtiden?
Well, the best advice for young people to change the future, to be active in public debate and forward your views, and to study. I mean, to get knowledgeable about important subjects and contribute your knowledge to the public debate. I mean, it's always much easier to have an impact in the debate if you know what you're talking about, not just crying out whatever comes up in your mind, but to study a subject and give a balanced view, but very much come with fresh insights that elder people haven't thought of. We would benefit from that.
So, thank you and thank you. Do we have any questions from our online community?
We do have one asking, well, I'll take it in Swedish. Varför är det så få kvinnor som får Nobelpriset i ekonomi?
Well, the reason why we don't have more women laureates in economics is basically the same that relates to the other prizes, namely that there has not been as many female researchers as male before. But what is important is that the prize committees in all the prizes that are awarded by the Royal Academy, they made very strong efforts to invite people to come up with nominations for female researchers. And Esther Duflo the other year was one of the most nominated persons. So many economists agreed that she was a well-justified prize earner. And I hope there will be more.
Thank you. And now we thank you, Grillska Universitet, Grillska Gymnasiet, sorry, from Västerås, and Gunnar Wetterberg for your insights, and all the people watching online. So, have a good day. Thank you.